All right, Group 11, Teaching Ethics to an International and Multicultural Group.
Yeah, so I apologize. I couldn't remember our actual title, so I just tried to summarize. That seemed like what we were talking about. So I'm a biomedical engineer from Illinois Institute of Technology, so I apologize for maybe clumsy terminology, but one thing I have learned is I will not call anything an ethical dilemma unless it really is. So I feel like international and multicultural aspects of ethics is pretty broad, but we spent a lot of time, so we kind of categorized different things. We primarily looked at the international side rather than kind of domestic multiculturalism, but I think a lot of the solutions and problems we've encountered can be applied more broadly. So we talked about international students entering U.S. institutions at the undergraduate or graduate levels, domestic students who go abroad to study. We had representation from industry who think about, multinational corporations and working in different countries. We also thought about faculty teaching abroad. We had examples of that, and international research collaborations. Most of the focus was around working with students who come to the U.S. to study. But again, I think some of the things we came up with have broader applicability. So some of the factors that we came up with were related to trust and kind of this power hierarchy in academia and how different cultures approach that. Some who are fearful of the hierarchy, some who are maybe overly deferential, or maybe some students who don't respect that hierarchy in different ways. And a lot of it was around speaking up, both in terms of empowering students who come to the U.S. to talk about things and to be open in expressing their opinions and feeling free to express these things. And also within companies, the idea of people to be able to feel comfortable standing up to or identifying potential issues within the company or ethical considerations there. I think most of us in the academic world recognize that there's often questions in regards to academic integrity and different standards or making sure it's clear to students when they come in. The other side of it that I feel is a common problem here is paternalism and having cultural humility. So when you go abroad or when you deal with students, that you recognize that our way is not the only way or the best way necessarily, but at least being open to these things. And kind of a subset of that, but difference, is internal biases. And I'll bring up the internal biases because the academic integrity was often couched within our group around Asian students and plagiarism. So there's certainly a clear thought that maybe students from Asia are more likely to plagiarize, and so that creates an internal bias, I would imagine, right? So the most promising approaches, generally we talked about, again, this is why I think this is broadly applicable, is recognizing people as individuals. So recognize that all people have different backgrounds, and certainly it's a little easier to recognize this with international students, and there's these distinct things, but approaching it that way and maybe trying to address where these differences are. Working with students to build personal relationships is probably good advice for any faculty member with any student, but really to understand where they're coming from and what why they approach things a certain way. We also talked about ways to incorporate into curriculum, allowing students to identify their learning style, but also we talked about participation, this overemphasis where we discussed, you need students to speak out in class. As somebody who didn't speak out in class, and it took 13 years of academia for me to feel remotely comfortable with this, that's not the only way to provide input, and it shouldn't be the only way it's valued. The other thing in terms of kind of some of these integrity issues is defining what the expected behaviors are up front, but also defining this in a way to recognize that it's, these are different cultural norms and value systems. Some things are right and wrong, but some things are just different. And one of our colleagues in the group said it's a difference in size. It's important to recognize, I'm going to probably butcher this, but it's a difference in magnitude and not kind, right? We do a lot of things here that it's just a different magnitude, but it's kind of the same thought process. An example was given that around child labor that I didn't know about how in the West Coast in California and some of the farming systems, depending on the time of year, children 8, 9 years old, probably all the ethicists know this example is something, but are allowed to work. So we do things, it's just a different magnitude. And that couches it, presents it a little differently and is maybe a little more sensitive. And the other thing we thought about is when you're going into any environment is for people to perform self-assessment and understand your strengths and weaknesses and maybe your biases, but also as academics to kind of, to model that behavior and try to encourage that kind of thing. So for the community of attendees, I mean, there's a lot of outstanding programs that are developed in posters out there for different things. I mean, I think to me, it would be great to see programs that focus on integrating and working with in international environments and best practices and really assessment of all these things. So integrating things people are doing, these techniques people are using and looking specifically at the international component. And I'd assume almost all of those programs already have international aspects to them, right? International students, multicultural environments, and you could start looking at that within your own framework and your own programs if you're not already. And the other thing we talked about is engaging international partners. Having this conversation with people from other countries and other cultures domestically and abroad, right? And thinking about this not as, me standing back and trying to think about how others look at it, right? And really engaging partners in this conversation. For the broader engineering community, we talked about acknowledging the challenges and opportunities. What does that mean? One of the things we said is there's challenges in developing students who, when they go into practice, understand or can appreciate or anticipate some of the ethical challenges or value challenges that they'll face. But this is an opportunity to kind of cut off some potential problems down the line. We had a wealth of case studies, I think, within our group alone from all the kind of international interactions people had, that if people were started at a different point, maybe they would be able to have at least mitigated some of the problems, if not eliminated them altogether. And the other thing we talked about is there's a lot of diversity on campus discussions, but there's a feeling that the international diversity, at least in terms of training and preparing and talking about it in more depth, is limited and could be done at a higher or better level. So that's all I've got. I'm happy to answer any questions, or at least defer to my colleagues.
One suggestion of something to add would be, I think engineering ethics hasn't really caught up to the broader philosophy community in terms of thinking about our own Western bias in the history of ethical thought and the sort of and the Northern bias that that continues to persist in academia in the U.S. So we've got some long traditions that we could draw on that aren't Western in nature. So that's one thing. And then the other thing I would bring up is when we're thinking about student lives, I think folks that are in certain regions of this country have a lot of undocumented students that are facing particular issues and increasing. Particularly, since this election season, increasing problems that are, everything from administrative obstacles like not being able to get scholarships. The state of Arizona removed scholarships for undocumented students some years ago. And this is also for international students who are on visas, they're often not eligible for opportunities that U.S. students aren't. So being sensitive to those kinds of power and privilege and what we can do to protect particularly students from anti-immigrant bias these days is an ethical issue.
Perfect preamble for my comment. I think the related point would be to engage students in conversations around cross-national and cross-cultural differences and what it means to be ethical as a professional. On one hand, that opens up opportunities for bringing these student voices into the room to talk more generally about what does it mean to be ethical or moral from my cultural perspective, and then what does that have? What implications does that have in terms of what does it mean to be ethical as a professional? We know that engineers from different parts of the world have very different understandings of what it means to be ethical. We have case study evidence of that, and I think that's an important thing to bring in. And it's also something we're hearing from industry. Industry might feel relatively more confident in being able to deal with some of these ethics issues in the context of the U.S., but they're increasingly facing challenges in the global workforce and working across countries and cultures where the codes of ethics are different, the regulatory structures are different, the expectations for professional conduct are different, the corporate cultures are different. So we're hearing from industry a real demand for helping them think about how do they deal with those global dimensions of engineering practice.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something related maybe to both points. Is what we talked about with this, with all of the activities, was the ideas of doing this so that you can have this broader discussion. I mean, that's what we talked about, was enabling this discussion where we could see different people's perspectives. And in regards to the specifics of different kind of biases, I mean, what we tried to do is say, here's, in my mind, what we tried to do is say, here's guidelines that are generally applicable. Because we would go off into a discussion of a specific group, right, and people's different experiences, but the general idea of where are our biases, whether it be domestic with differences there, within ethics, within engineering, within value systems there and here, and what specific problems have, whether they're undocumented, international, different countries, they're all in their, they're all unique in kind of their perspective, and that's where we have to make sure we could, the general idea of making sure we discuss these things is important.
Okay, one more comment at each microphone.
So this has been a really great, I think, discussion. I think it's somewhat at a meta level, and I'd like to point out a couple of examples where it could be grounded in some difficult pedagogical challenges and possible opportunities. One is that a lot of the tools and the thinking that we associate with moral philosophy and ethical reasoning in professional practice, I think, are very much rooted in a Western individualistic tradition, that you have a rational actor who's standing on the chessboard of life and has to make some choices between alternatives, and the different models can sort of prune the alternatives in different ways, according to rights and outcomes and so forth. And my computer scientist students are that's a very engineering-friendly way of looking at the human condition, and I think ethics they relate to things in that way. I think students coming from a more communitarian culture, specifically, who are likely to evaluate ethics not in terms of a right and wrong conduct of an individual in a given situation, but the building of harmonious relationships and so forth, have a very different perspective. And so this is one of the multicultural perspectives I think we could actually concretely focus on and say, well, what is the worth of actually developing educational models around contrasting these views, particularly since so many of our students are actually international students from such a background. And the second thing is that I was reminded of Carol Gilligan's work looking at the moral development of girls and women versus boys and men, and she's very careful not to make dichotomous sort of kind of distinctions between the genders, but there are nevertheless different strategies for thinking about and framing moral problems that I think, and one of which tends to be much more valorized in engineering thinking than the other, and it's no accident that that's been the case. It's a very engineering-friendly way to look at life that I think, as one of her young boy subjects in her experiments said, it's like doing algebra with people's lives. And whereas the previous group, I applaud the whole idea of tools wasn't just tools for calculating outcomes, but also for thinking about moral imagination. Because an alternative approach is not to think of moral situations, framing them as dilemmas or choices, but as opportunities for creating solutions, as a design problem. And that's much more, I think, akin to what Gilligan was identifying as an approach in Western moral philosophy that's been really subverted and not really submerged, rather, for the last couple of hundred years. And it's something that we really ought to take much more seriously in a much more, I think, masculine-dominated profession in the form of engineering.
So I agree 100%. I'm not, don't necessarily know all the literature, but I would only point out one thing, that I think the simplistic view that engineers like a simple model sells us short, right? I mean, I think complex interactions, especially in biomedical engineering, is certainly something we think about. So we're okay with models that aren't just a chessboard or checkers for me.
Thanks. I want to make a comment that was very similar to Brent, but I would say not only should we encourage students to try to understand each other's perspectives, but this, I think, it'd be the actual avenue to get ethical discussions going. I know from my own lab that I have students from all over the world, and they enjoy talking to each other about their cultures and sharing their backgrounds. They bring in food for their various holidays. And so this could be a way to broach a subject that is not naturally something that they talk about and get them going.
Good point.